Good afternoon, everyone. We are live on YouTube and just waiting to get started as people are continuing to trickle in. So please mute your audio and we will get started here momentarily. Good afternoon, everybody. Folks are still kind of trickling in here, and I think we've also got a little bit of a split room situation where we have a few people in another Zoom room. So we're going to work on getting them over into the correct Zoom, and we will get started here momentarily.
Hey guys, just want to let you all know I'm still with some children, so I'm going to have my camera off. But as soon as my little one's going home, then I'll turn it back on.
Totally understand. Thanks, Daryl. Thanks, folks, for your patience. We'll give everybody just another couple minutes to log on, and then we'll get started. All right. It looks like our last few folks are trickling in here. I know we may have a few additional joining us in the next couple of minutes, but we will go ahead and get started. So I'm going to kick us off by calling roll here, and then I will turn it over to Shaiki to officially start the meeting. All right. Cecilia.
Here.
Jennifer.
Here.
Clark.
Clark's trying to get in. We're still trying to figure out why he's going to the other one.
Okay, we'll give him a moment. Cheryl. Oh, there you are, Cheryl. Bev. Kristen.
Here.
Shaiki.
Here.
Angela.
Here.
Daryl.
Hey, I'm here.
Gina. Vivian.
Here.
Michelle.
Here.
Kia.
Here.
Miriam, I'm sorry.
Here.
Bergen.
Here.
Sandy.
Here.
Taryn. Sarah.
Here.
Grace let me know she was going to be late. Roberta.
Here.
And Angela. Word.
I'm here.
Great. We've got a quorum, so I think we can go ahead and get started.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good afternoon, Advisory Committee. Hope that you all had a safe and pleasant summer. We have quite a few presentations this afternoon that we're looking forward to. But before we do, we have some full advisory board information to cover. You should have received an amended agenda from Rebecca on yesterday with a few additions under Roman numeral 1. There should be an A, B, C, and D. Hopefully you have received that amended agenda. And at this point, do we have a motion to approve the amended agenda as presented?
So moved.
Motion has been made by Vivian. Do we have a second?
Second.
Second by Roberta. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Ayes have it, motion carried. Thank you. The approval of the July meeting minutes, and you should also receive this in an additional email for review. Do we have any questions or amendments to the minutes for July? Hearing none, do we have a motion to accept the minutes as presented?
So moved.
Motion's been made by Ms. Steen. Do we have a second?
I second.
Second by Ms. Johnson. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Ayes have it, motion carried. Thank you. I will now turn over to Rebecca to give us an update on our committee membership, as well as some exciting news about an update on our meeting formats. Rebecca.
Sure. Thanks, Tracy.
Back
So
up.
as
Sorry,
as-
is Clark in the waiting room? He's still trying to get in.
no, we don't have anyone in the waiting room.
Okay, all right, thanks.
So as you all know, Sharice stepped down from the advisory committee earlier this summer as she took another position outside of the early childhood sector. So we are in the process of identifying a replacement for her position. So the Board of Education will vote on an individual to fill that vacancy at the meeting later this month. And the information about the board meeting, including agenda items and a link to the live stream, is all available on the Board of Education website if you're interested in taking a look there. So assuming that person is approved, they will be able to join us for our November meeting, which is great news. And then I will turn it over to Jenna to talk a little bit about meeting formats looking forward.
Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. Becca, can you all hear me well? Great.
Yes.
Wonderful to welcome everybody. Today marks an important day for us here at the Department of Education as we are returning to the office right now at least one day a week. And so we are still figuring out the technology. I appreciate everybody's grace and patience as we do this and as we figure this out. To stay safe, you'll note that you still see most of us in different offices, but we're excited to take this step forward in being able to return to in person. It's also really exciting to hear from Daryl and Sarah and others about being with kids. And I know that's, as of Monday, I believe we'll have all of our schools back open and offering an in-person option to kids across the Commonwealth. I know that folks like Shaiki and her Head Start partners are working fast and furious to open in person and get back to full in-person enrollment by January. And of course, we know that so many of our childcare and family day home programs are open and have been operational, but it's really exciting. As much as it is challenging to continue to deal with COVID and the Delta variant, it's just so good to know that kids are back. Me personally, my daughter and son started first grade and third grade respectively last week at Richmond Public Schools, which is very exciting. And then my 3-year-old went back at the beginning of August. So just really exciting and so appreciative to all of our educators across the Commonwealth who are making this possible. In light of that, I wanted to also announce today that we're going to shift back to in-person meetings. And so with the end of the state of emergency in the Commonwealth, it really means now that for purposes of Virginia's open meetings law, that it's important that we offer these formats in person, both so that folks can participate in terms of the members of our committee, as well as to be able to hear from others or to have others observe it if they would want to beyond the live stream, which I know we have on YouTube. So more details to come on this, but wanted to let you all know in terms of planning purposes that we've got a November and December meeting set up, and we will offer an in-person option. We will want to achieve in-person quorum. And so what we'll do is we'll work very closely with Shaiki to get an understanding of who can come back, where that's practically possible, depending on kind of what's going on with your day job and with your kind of concerns about health and safety. We know that kids are quarantining and there are obstacles at work, whether that's driving the bus or needing to be present for whatever reason. And so I think what we're going to do is figure out as we get closer to the date of the meeting to get a tally of who we think can be in person, see if there's any concerns about quorum, and then go from there. But we imagine it'll be a hybrid of folks either in the room here in Richmond at the Board of Education, sorry, at the Department of Education building, and folks dialing in. And we have made some investments in technology here at our building in Richmond so that we're able, if you're in the room, you'll be able to see on the big screen all of those folks who are participating virtually. And if you're participating virtually, we've adjusted the video and the sound technology so you'll be able to hear everybody in the room. So again, we're working behind the scenes as we get closer to November to be able to offer an in-person option for you all, as well as stakeholders who might want to participate in person. We will get back to you. If you can't make it or you have other concerns, we'll sort of work through some of the attendance and technology issues, but very excited to announce this. We haven't ever had the opportunity to meet in person as this group started virtually. And so I know I'm looking forward to being able to meet some of you in person, as well as to continue to connect virtually for those that's not possible right now. And I think as it stands, as we think about the next, over the course of the next school year or kind of the fiscal year, what we'll probably do is just tally attendance for each meeting, or kind of again on a case-by-case basis. As I know many of you you might be able to do it in November, but if things change on the ground in December, we understand. And so we won't, what we'll just do is do it case-by-case, meeting by meeting. Are there any questions about that?
Thank
All
you,
right.
Kayla. So I guess you can just run right on through the presentation.
Excellent. So with that, as a way of reminder, we have two different types of agenda items for our Early Childhood Advisory Committee. There are update items, and these are important cross-sector items for which we want to share information with you all. We want you to have the most up-to-date information. We want to get your feedback if there are things that we're missing, if there are points that aren't clear, but they really are functionally updates. So these are items that we share with you because they're strategically important, but they don't necessarily result in a decision item that goes to the board. The second type of item are those things where we actively seek your endorsement because they're going to the State Board of Education. And so again, those are the two items that the two types of items that we've dealt with as an advisory committee over the course of our existence. For today's purposes, these are all update items. And so we've got a board meeting next week, and the only item that we have coming up during that board meeting is, as Becca noted, naming that missing member. So we'll have a full roster, but we're not taking any of these update items to the board. So the real purpose for this afternoon session is to make sure that you have some of this up-to-date information on key strategic cross-sector early childhood issues. And again, I'll take you through each of these update presentations. And then we'll hold time at the end of each one if there's any questions or concerns, but we won't be asking our chair, Shaiki, to do a vote or for endorsement on any of these items today. So with that, I'm going to jump into our first item. And this is a really important follow-up to some of our work around building a unified early childhood care and education system here in the Commonwealth. In the past, I've presented to you information on our efforts to unify the system, to move oversight of early childhood care and education from various state agencies to one division here at the Department of Education. And we sought your endorsement on the practice year guidelines for VQB5, which is our new uniform measurement and improvement system. When we endorse those, I know we talked a lot about what it will take to implement that and how we will make sure that we have the right infrastructure and capacity across the Commonwealth to support the measurement and to support all of our educators as they seek to improve on their adult-child interactions. We seek to use more curriculum. We seek to retain educators using that innovative incentive. And so what I'm pleased to be able to bring to you all today is some updates on efforts going on to build and put in place the right regional infrastructure to fully establish our unified early childhood care and education system, as well as to lay the foundation for VQB5, the system that you endorsed at a prior meeting. So with that, let's go to the next slide, please. So like much of the work that we bring to you all, and when I think back about even the applications to be a part of this committee, we know that this is long-standing work. And before talking about where we're going, I always think it's important to acknowledge where we've been. And so as a state kind of coming together across Virginia communities, working across silos, right? So whether you work for Head Start, you work in a childcare center, you're employed by a school division, you run a childcare program out of your home, they're sort of starting as early as 16 years ago, right? There were efforts at the local level to build local systems that connected the various Birth to 5 programs. That's evolved. Our Smart Beginnings partners across the state, which are inclusive of childcare, of school-based programming, of Family Day Homes and Head Start, have kind of continued to evolve. Most recently, we received a significant amount of federal funding known as the Preschool Development Grant, which you've heard us talk about within this group, and use that to directly fund some of this cross-sector work, the mixed delivery, coordinating enrollment, building the foundation for VQB5. As we look forward and we now have a unification law in place and we're charged with figuring out how do we support all of our unique publicly funded infant, toddler, and preschool classrooms, we realize that we need to build infrastructure that fully assures that we're inclusive of every classroom, every educator, every child, and every family. That sometimes our systems have ended up benefiting those that are connected to resources, those that are aware of those resources, and we've got to make sure no matter where you go in the Commonwealth that you have equitable access to services and support. I think that's been made even more important as we look at some of the systemic inequities, particularly on systemic racism and its effect on the early childhood system, as well as the disparate way in which COVID-19 has affected some of our most vulnerable communities, providers, and families across the Commonwealth. Next slide, please. Another way to think about it is to, again, go back and look at the work we've done over the last 3 years through the Preschool Development Grant. So as you'll remember, this is a really significant investment in the state, and nearly all of it went to either Virginia communities or Virginia educators, right? Our biggest investments were to support the PDG community networks in which many of you participated, and or to support our early childhood educators who receive that incentive. We have run now 3 rounds of asking folks to be a part of this, asking communities to be a part of it, and in turn, those communities reaching out to school-based, Head Start, childcare, and Family Day Home programs to kind of to include as many programs as possible, as many classrooms as possible in time for practice year 1. And yet, when you look at this map, you still see that there are some gaps, right? Those light gray areas for which there's not full coverage. You also see that there's a lot of different colors, and I don't even know if I could name all of the colors here, but it's pretty tough to kind of think about how we support this work when you have sort of enormous, like multi-county areas mixed up with places that are like one community, right? Which has maybe far fewer programs. And so what this map really tells us is we've got to figure out how do we make sure we include every single community, provider, classroom, kid, and family in the Commonwealth, and that we do it in a way that's sustainable, right, and comprehensive, so that we kind of move from what was a pilot and some early innovative efforts around the Preschool Development Grant to something that we can sustain as a department in partnership with partners like the Virginia Early Childhood Foundation, as well as this ECAC, our board, and communities across the Commonwealth. Next slide, please. With that in mind, we've done some work with our PDG communities. We've worked very closely with the Virginia Early Childhood Foundation, and as well as our key stakeholders across the state to re-envision what a regional approach might look like, and really thinking through how can we be inclusive of every community, every provider, every kid and family. How can we sort of build something that's sustainable, right? That isn't sort of 30 counties in this particular network and one and that particular network. How do we strike that right balance from wanting enough consistency statewide, right? So that no matter where you go, you can access a stable and capable network, but also not have this dictated from Richmond, right? To allow communities, localities to be entrepreneurial enough so that they can be nimble and responsive to their needs. What the Southwest region needs and desires might be different from NOVA, right? Which might be entirely different from Tidewater, and really thinking about, how do we strike that right balance? We know this has to be public-private, right? And we know that sort of a good percentage of our members of this ECAC are representative of the private sector, and that's what makes early childhood so powerful. We're a public-private partnership. We have an array of providers and stakeholders, and we know it's going to take both sides to make it work. And ultimately, we've got to figure out, how do we set up an infrastructure that, again, allows that unification, right? That is our true north of what we're trying to achieve. We have to be working together, speaking the same language, able to share our knowledge, practices, expertise, if we are going to move the needle and make sure that more kids have access to early childhood experiences that put them on track for success, and that we're supporting our educators to support our kids to thrive. So with that, what we are proposing is a shift away from a kind of a mix of sort of hyper local and regional or kind of multi-community to a straight up regional approach for the state. And what I'm going to do is take a couple of minutes to walk you through how that might work. Next slide, please. So we're calling this Ready Regions, and some of you might be very familiar with this terminology. For some, this might be brand new. But what we're looking is we want to invest in organizations across the state to be our systems builder. We want to make sure that there is one organization in charge, kind of in various regions in the state, and that they are responsible for coordinating and integrating our critical services, early childhood services. And we'll start with early childhood care and education. This will help us make sure that all of our communities, all of our providers, all of our kids and families are included and we can sort of achieve more equity. And we know it will take a partnership, right? So while we'll have one entity responsible in each of our regions across the state, which again, many other types of government in Virginia are organized regionally, right? We've got social service regions, we've got Department of Education superintendent regions, right? So a lot of our work is organized regionally. And even though we need to have one entity in charge, we know this fundamentally, as I said before, will be about public and private partnerships. So making sure it's inclusive of school divisions, social and human services, our improvement networks, our programs themselves, really kind of fully inclusive and very much a partnership. Next slide, please. This is the current proposal. And again, we've worked very closely with the Early Childhood Foundation as a key private partner here to look at the map of the state, to review all of the various regions and regional structures that exist, to analyze the number of kids birth to 5 and the distribution of programs across the state, to think about the geography, right? There's certain areas, if you look at 7, where it looks geographically small, but those of you who live in that area know that there's a lot of people, in that geography, as compared to maybe South Side or Southwest, where it's a larger geography, but it's, it's more rural and more distributed. Thinking about our most vulnerable kids and families, so really looking at where we've sort of the number and percentage of children below the poverty level, what's a sort of more equitable way to distribute that across the state, and then really thinking again about our our BIPOC populations, or Black, Indigenous, or communities of color, and making sure that we're very thoughtful about how we organize these regions to assure full inclusion of all of our programs, all of our kids, and all of our families. So this is our current recommendation. As part of the application process, we will ask the applying entities to make sure that they can fully cover this region. But as you see, unlike the map that I just showed you, that this assures full coverage of every single community in the Commonwealth. Next slide, please. So what will these ready regions do? So again, the key thing here is we're going to have these one organization in charge of making sure that we're coordinating services, starting with early childhood care and education. So the big one is making sure that you're coordinating the quality measurement and the support for improvement across our early childhood care and education classrooms and our family day homes. So really this foundation for the VQB5 system. This means that these groups will help us confront the racial inequities within our system. They're building the relationships, and we've learned through the work of Smart Beginnings, through the work of the Preschool Development Grant, through the work of Head Starts and VPI programs as we sought to expand access, that this all at its core is about relationships, making sure that we are inviting and being inclusive of every last publicly funded program, and then some that serves our birth to 5 population. We will charge and fund these programs to make sure that we can observe all of the 10,000 classrooms that we talked about when we laid out that plan for VQB5, and really thinking about how you prepare those educators to participate in those observations, how you make sure you give feedback and support to every last classroom in our system. We will work with these partners to grapple with how do we increase access. And you've heard me talk a lot about the impact of the pandemic on preschool participation, but really thinking through when we get new dollars, how do we fairly and equitably distribute them? How can we work within regions to design enrollment systems that work best for those programs, those providers, those kids and families? I know that's something we've heard from Shaki, for example, about what they've sort of designed in terms of coordinated enrollment in her area, and that might look different from an area in Central Virginia or Northern Virginia, right? That's a locally, enrollment is one of those things that's best determined locally or regionally. And then of course, as our children's first educators, really thinking through how do we engage families? And I know that's something that's really important. When I think back to some of our guiding principles, and we talked about VQB5, I can't remember if it was maybe Roberta, but we said it's really important that we name family engagement as a core guiding principle for that work. And we know that our regions are better positioned than say Richmond is to deeply engage our families, our guardians, our extended families as children's first and most important teachers. And so really also charging our ready regions or these organizations to make sure that they are involving families in the design of the system, not as an afterthought. Next slide, please. Those lays out the sort of most immediate objectives. And again, many of the things I've just named, you've probably heard us talk about, right? And Ready Regions is the way to fund and to invest and to make sure that those things are happening in every community in the Commonwealth. As we go forward, we hope that these regions will continue to expand, right? And really, particularly on those matters of access, as we think about if we can get significant new state and federal dollars, how do we make sure that those turn into slots that work for families, right? That work for providers. When we think about things like coordinating enrollment and how we work best together, and then continuing to even look at how we connect the systems. I know when we sort of think about after school time, we think about social indicators of health, right? And we know that kids need to come to school sort of healthy and safe and well prepared, right? And that's not just about our early childhood care and education system, but kids develop and grow in the context of communities. And so really thinking about how we can use our Ready Regions to bring together cross-sector leaders to collaborate on these priorities. Next slide, please. This gives you a sense of what we're expecting with Ready Regions. And again, this idea of, we think that for the most part, this will be existing organizations that are going to step up and play this role. We are looking for organizations that have some stability, have a governance board, understand how to engage families, are prepared to handle significant amounts of money, right? We need to make an investment in our regional capacity. We're looking for leadership that can run and successfully execute against these ambitious goals, and can assemble a diverse team to support this work. And we think that there's going to be different arrangements, right? Again, we don't expect that all of this work will be done by one organization, but that the lead organization will really think through who the right partners are on the ground to get the work done. Whether that's observing classrooms, whether that's coordinating enrollment, but really important that these are trusted partners within our regions across the Commonwealth. Next slide, please. So as I noted before, and I wanted to share this with this advisory committee so you're aware of it, but we were planning and preparing to make a significant investment in our regional capacity. I know one of the things I've heard from this group, and I know is of concern, is that nobody is looking for unfunded mandates, right? If we're going to ask organizations to step up and play a really important role to partner with other organizations and to help us accomplish these goals and do this work, like we need to invest in this capacity to be able to sustain it. You know, we've got to move from what was a temporary grant, something like the preschool development grant, to something that's more sustainable, owned by Virginia, and carrying forward. And so our current budget right now, and we're still finalizing as we go into the budget process for the next 2 years, but is that we will likely need just ballpark of $13 million to be able to support these entities. The funding will be based on the total number of publicly funded classrooms, some family day homes. We know that sometimes our family day homes, and we know we've talked to Cheryl and others, these incredible programs often don't receive the kind of the full support that they need. And so making sure that we're hiring and getting enough staff to fully support them, looking at what it takes to build relationships, coordinate enrollment, and engage families. And then again, as I talked about, when we heard and we sort of rolled out VQB5, one of the questions that came up from this group, as well as from the Board of Education, well, how will you make sure that all this happens, and kind of making sure that we invest in getting these observations done, preparing and supporting our teachers is a key part of these dollars. Next slide, please. So here's what's next. And this is, as you'll see, these are upcoming or just past dates, which is why we wanted to bring this as an update to this group today. But we are working very closely with the Virginia Early Childhood Foundation. They're running the competitive process to identify a lead entity in each of those 9 regions. It started with a competitive letter of interest process, which went through earlier this month. Those select groups in each of the regions will be invited to submit a full application, and then we'll have a full competitive process to identify a lead in each of the 9 regions. We will then provide some startup funding from January to June for folks to get their bearing, to be prepared to support practice year 2 of VQB5. And then we will provide full funding for next year, so that when we come back to you all and talk about some of the guidelines and expectations for practice year 2, that you can feel confident and the Board of Education can feel confident that that work can get done, because we are building the necessary regional capacity and infrastructure to get that work done, and to do it in a way that is fully inclusive of all of our programs, regardless of the name on the outside of the building or the funding source, all of our kids, families, and educators. So let me pause there before we move into the Child Care Stabilization Grant Program and see if there's any questions. Again, this was an update largely because, as I just described, there's some really important things happening this fall, and we wanted you to be aware of them, particularly as this is the group that did endorse the VQB5 guidelines. But we don't need an endorsement, but I wanted to hold some time and space to see if there are questions, concerns, points that folks would like me to clarify as it relates to ready regions and some of that work to build the infrastructure to achieve some of the goals of this advisory committee. And either chat or raise your hand, and then Becca or Shaki, if you see people raising their hand. Oh, Dr. Nelson.
Hi, everybody. Yes, thank you so much, Jenna. That's really exciting. And as you know, I sit on the board of Smart Beginnings Greater Richmond, so I know a little bit about the ready regions coming down the path. I think it's a great development. And I wanted to also just let folks at this table know that the Department of Health in their early childhood division led by Bethany Geldmacher received a HRSA grant just very recently in the last month, an early childhood comprehensive systems grant. And I really hope that we can use that as a complementary way to really fold in that health, both prenatal and early childhood health and mental health and other services into the Ready Regions work. So I just wanted to let folks know that. And anyone who's interested in being part of that work, we probably will reach out to many of you, but others who might be interested, please let me know.
Excellent, thank you. And that's really exciting, Dr. Nelson. I think one of the points in why we wanted to share the longer term vision, and some of it might happen sooner rather than later in some of our communities, is that we know, and we've heard from this group, right, that kids need more than just care and education, right? That they grow and sort of, they need health, they need healthy nutrition, right? There's sort of a whole array of supports that kids need, not to mention, as we know from our Head Start and early Head Start partners, the importance of comprehensive services for parents and families. And so I think thinking through how we can leverage additional new grants like the one that Dr. Nelson referred to, or kind of into existing systems. I know that was something that was really important as we looked with BCF at the current regions.
And I think Roberta unmuted to speak. And then
oh yeah, Roberta, do you have a question too? And then I'll go to the chat.
Just a very general one. Once the 9 hub leaders, I'm calling it a hub, maybe you're not using that anymore, but the leader of each of these regions, once they are selected, is there kind of a rollout template for letting people know who are potential partners in each of those regions, that now there's this support or resource? I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but I mean, I know you'll announce it and everything, but what I'm thinking about is just in terms of equity and access, how will people with boots on the ground, especially if they're not already a really strong region like some of these are, they already kind of exist and have an infrastructure, but there are those, we're among them, that really don't. And I'm just wondering where the thinking was on
that. Yeah, that's a great question, Roberta. So I'll answer it in two ways. So certainly encouraging folks to even have started that outreach. It was a part of the LOI process as well as the application process, right? Kind of asking folks about who they're partnering with, really that will be kind of considered. We fully acknowledge that different areas of the state are in different places, right? And so there's in some places a lot of that legwork has been done, and other places, there's more work to be done. The other key thing and decision that was made was to not try to do a sort of a quick switch over, right? So that what we'll be funding in the next year is we'll continue to support our PDG community networks that exist sort of throughout this year, and funding the Ready Regions at the same time, with this idea that 6-month startup period is really focused on hiring the right people, getting these relationships in place, thinking about those partnerships, right? So that they're not expected to kind of do class observations or coordinate enrollment at that time, but really just focused on the building of relationships. And that's a slide I pulled out for time purposes today, but when we look at kind of what our expectations are for the first 6 months, is exactly what you described. We know that even for some areas, 6 months may not fully be sufficient, but that's at least a starting point. And then I think we will continue to really work on, to the point about equity, how do we make sure that this is fully inclusive? And oftentimes, our systems have been more around who seeks services, who asks for assistance, and we're really trying to change that narrative and sort of be inclusive of everybody, who's serving our most vulnerable kids and families. Kristen asked a question about, have we received applications from all regions? So the information just come in, but I do understand that we do have letters of intent from all 9 regions. I don't, Sandy, have full information on who's applied, but we will work closely with VCF to think about what would be appropriate to share. And then let me see we've got one more question. From
Michelle, she said, will the PDG funds be dispersed through Ready Region hubs instead of the current PDG leads beginning in fiscal year 23? It's a great question.
Yeah, so that's right, Michelle. So partly what we're doing is we're, PDG, I know it's hard to believe, was a time limited grant. And so we're shifting away from that funding source, which was ultimately set to expire, and shifting towards more sustainable state and federal sources. So really kind of thinking through not only how would you need, for instance, $13 million to support this regional infrastructure next year, but that you're accounting for that in fiscal year 24 and 25, right? That as we have this unified measurement and improvement system, as we continue to seek to serve more and more children with public dollars, right? We've got to invest in this infrastructure. So our intent is that we shift away from PDG networks. Again, we'll sort of fund them through the duration of this fiscal year, and then fund them both for a little while in the latter half of this fiscal year. But yes, by fiscal year 23, that we've moved away from PDG community networks and are focused on our ready regions. So that way we can ensure that every classroom that wants to be, and every program that wants to be part of practice year 2 can be. Every educator, we're about 85% now, but we know that our educator incentive, which has gone up to $2,000 per educator, is limited to whether or not your community is part of, PDG historically. And so making sure that educator incentive is available to all of our publicly funded family day homes and childcare programs across the state. And then as we continue to invest through VQB5, through increasing access to things like mixed delivery and enhancements to the Virginia Preschool Initiative, as well as to strengthen the childcare subsidy program, making sure that we are doing them in a way that's equitable statewide, right? And everybody has to be represented. And Ready Regions, we think, is the best way to make sure that there's full representation of all of our communities, all of our providers across the Commonwealth. These are great questions.
Don't see any more questions in the chat box. I just have one, just one more question. As you think about the transition from PDG to the Ready Regions, those communities that did not voluntarily participate in PDG, when Ready Regions evolve, will they automatically have access to those services, or only if they were a part of PDG?
Exactly. That's the goal, right? So we want to move, and I don't know a better descriptor than this. Like right now, we have that little bit of that Swiss cheese effect, right? Where some areas of the state are covered and some are not. There's those holes, and so the goal here is to make sure that there's full coverage. We would work then with our regional partners, as Roberta described, our hub partners, to do special outreach to those folks that haven't participated previously. So when you think about either our programs within the communities that are currently covered that have chosen to opt out, or those grayed areas of the state that haven't had the chance to participate yet. But that's a great point, Shaiki, and a top priority is to make sure that we are doing the most intensive outreach, particularly in that 6-month period going into practice year 2, right? We are really, it's such a big deal, particularly with everything that's going on in the field right now, to seek to observe every classroom and support every educator, to be talking about curriculum in the way we are, right? To be increasing the number of slots. And so we just want to make sure that no one's in the dark, right? Particularly our programs that take public dollars. And so this is a way to do that. And we will work in that 6-month period that Roberta was asking about, to kind of really do that intensive outreach to those places that may not have been aware of or had the opportunity to participate previously.
Thank you.
Excellent. So I will probably have more information either at our November or December meeting, which is really exciting as we start this work, and we really sort of seek to be fully inclusive to make sure every provider, every kid, and every family is fully represented in our unified system. My next set of updates is also really time sensitive, and wanted to share with this group, because I know as representatives of the sector, you are hearing about like the challenge that's continued to be faced by our providers, particularly our childcare providers and our family day homes. The last time we met was potentially a slightly more optimistic time before the Delta variant had sort of ravaged our state and our nation again. And I wanted to share some work we've been doing with the field around planning and preparing to implement a very fancy set of words, but the American Rescue Plan Act Child Care Stabilization Grant Program. So Becca, if you could take us to the next slide, please. So some of you have heard about this. We were talking in hypotheticals because we weren't able to use these dollars until they were appropriated by our General Assembly in the special session this August. But Virginia did receive just under $500 million via the American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA or ARPA. And the federal law was very clear that these dollars have to be used by all of the states to develop and implement a child care stabilization grant program. So we are excited about this, and we worked very closely with our General Assembly and the governor's office over the summer to share the requirements for the feds and how we thought Virginia should approach distributing these dollars to our programs. And what we're trying to do is to continue to stabilize our child care programs, for which we know there are economic and staffing and health and safety concerns. We are trying to encourage investments in people. We know we just continue to hear about staffing shortages, personal turnover, just it's very, very, very hard out there. And we're trying to bring folks back to our child care subsidy program. So you've heard me talk about this before, but historic enrollment drops in VPI, in Head Start, and in our child care subsidy program. And so really thinking through how we can encourage folks to come back. We know that will require some structural changes as well. We've heard from you on the rates, and that's something I'll talk about at the end today. But we also think that there could be financial incentives to bring people back. And we have learned, we've run 4 similar rounds of direct cash assistance known as the CARES program. And what continue as we've learned from each of these experiences to make sure that we are focused on providers and families who are furthest from opportunity. The more that we learn about this pandemic, the more we understand that it's having disparate effects on some of our most vulnerable kids, communities, and families. Next slide, please. I will say this is going to be a little wonky. So we're going to get into some details here. So I'm going to try not to read every word on every slide, but just kind of do the takeaways. And then we're going to get into some math, which is pretty aggressive for 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But, I want to make sure that we're transparent with what we're thinking about. But as I noted before, and just to be clear, in previous rounds of federal assistance for COVID, providing direct cash assistance was an option, but wasn't required. Virginia was one of the more forward-thinking states, and under the leadership of our General Assembly and under Commissioner Duke Soren, the Department of Social Services has run 4 rounds of CARES grant funding in partnership with the Early Childhood Foundation, and really the licensing team kind of took the lead on making sure that we could get these dollars out to programs. We, even though that wasn't required, right, we were able to get a lot of dollars, sort of over $200 million out the door to programs. And we've heard from many of you how appreciative you are of that. And we've learned some lessons from that. And I wanted to reassure you as an advisory committee that we're taking those lessons learned and applying it as we think about how to use the ARPA dollars. So we know that funding basis size alone doesn't really work in terms of some of our smaller programs tend to be enrolled at higher rates and didn't end up getting the same amount per kid as maybe some of our larger programs. We know that our programs are very appreciative of receiving the CARES dollars, but they, because of the nature of the funding and us not knowing when we would get additional dollars and not knowing what the pandemic would bring, it's hard for them to make strategic investments like, providing a staff bonus or increasing their wages if you don't know if it feels one time and you're not sure when the next set of dollars will come in. We know that people have really appreciated the flexibility. And so we have done probably upwards of 5 or 6 listening sessions on what people's pain points are. And we continue to hear different things from different providers. And so, making sure that Virginia is providing as much flexibility as possible. And we know that we've got to get better in terms of our application processes. And so we've been built this from scratch. The Department of Social Services, in partnership with us, figured out almost overnight how to set this thing up. But we know that it has been challenging, maybe not as challenging as things like the PPP, but still pretty tough for all of our programs to do. And so really thinking through how we can make a more simple application process, and then how we can reach some of those programs that maybe didn't apply or weren't aware in the beginning, including those who English might not be their first language, some of our family day home providers who are a little further from opportunity, but being very thoughtful about wanting to get this to every single program that could be eligible. Next slide, please. I'm going to talk briefly about where we don't have flexibility, because unlike CARES, where we could define every aspect of the system, we are subject to some requirements here. Next slide, please. So the key thing is that the law says who is eligible for these programs. So this is anybody who's licensed, registered, or otherwise regulated by the state as of March of this year, or are kind of approved child care subsidy program vendors. The law says we have to offer programs to providers whether they are open or temporarily closed. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that, although less of an issue here in the Commonwealth, where nearly everybody has reopened. Next slide, please. The federal law also says that our providers have to agree to the following. So if you'll remember, for those of you who participated in CARES 4, there's a set of things that you assured to for those. This just adds a few more things to make sure that Virginia stays in compliance with the federal law. So again, continuing to follow all the rules and regulations to the extent possible, following some of the really important health and safety guidance to make sure that we're supporting all of our employees, right? So we're not lowering their wages, not sort of laying folks off when you're receiving these dollars, to think about how you can best support families, and then to make sure that, generally speaking, that you're using the funds for the approved purposes. And I'll talk about those in a second. So again, somebody might say, well, wow, Jenny, you just said that you learned that flexibility was really important in CARES. Why would you add these things? And again, this is not something that we have a choice on. This is a federal requirement. So with more money, and again, ARPA is more money than we've been able to give out via CARES, but it does come with some additional strings. We are working very hard with the Office of Child Care in DC to make sure that we make the Virginia program as flexible as possible. Next slide, please. Good luck, Clark. Be safe. Clark's off to take the kids home on the bus. This is just a list of the allowable expenses. And again, when I think about what we've heard that people have used the CARES grants for, it's all of the things described here. So, just there are more federal strings, but generally speaking, there are many, many, many approved uses for this funding. Next slide, please. All right, let's get into the math. Next slide, please. So what we are working on right now is to be able to say to everybody, here's what you can expect to get. And it'll be either 2 or 3 payments on a quarterly basis to cover a 9-month period, with the payments beginning in this fall. We will accept applications as we're required to by law on a rolling basis, really through March of next year. And then we will use the grant system. Well, basically, if you need to make any changes, you can update it in the system and adjust your payments. But basically, if you sign up now, for instance, you can expect to receive multiple payments between now and early next year. Next slide. We will have a new application portal. We're going to move away from the system that was used previously so that you can create a login and can kind of go and look at your status, understand how much you've gotten. We are going to populate as much of that data as possible. Unfortunately, we can't just cut checks based on prior applications because of some of the new federal requirements, but we're working very closely with a technology vendor to make this as simple as possible. We are also going to create a help desk that will be fully staffed, multilingual, to help folks know, because we know even any change in technology can create some difficulty, and we'll also have email and text notifications. And so really working closely with our technology vendor, as well as with the Virginia Early Childhood Foundation, our Smart Beginnings, and other partners across the state to make this work as simply as possible for our programs, knowing that they will have to reapply. Next slide, please. We have done a series of listening sessions, and we have talked with outside experts. We have spoken with other states, and we have crunched lots of numbers. And we are pleased to share with you our current proposal for a formula that accounts for, as required by law, whether you're open or closed, whether you're full or part-time, your licensed or approved capacity, right? So it does account for size, and accounts for the community in which you operate. And so kind of being able to provide some additional dollars to those that are located in the high need community, as identified by the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index. So this is a kind of a nationally recognized way of understanding some of our higher need communities. We are also going to provide a one-time incentive for programs who are currently participating in the child care subsidy programs, as well as any programs that join will become a subsidy vendor between now and March. So really excited to kind of support those programs that are stepping up to serve some of our most vulnerable kids and families. Next slide, please. So here's the math, but basically the idea is we'll create a calculator for folks so you can plug in whether you're full or part-time, whether you're open or closed, what your capacity is, and then we'll be able to use your zip code or address to identify your census tract to help understand what your multiplier will be in terms of your social vulnerability index. So again, CARES generally was based on size alone and having to be open. And this one is slightly adjusted both for sort of full or part-time. We have some funding for programs that are closed, but not the same as for those that are open, and accounting for your vulnerability index in terms of the community in which you serve. Want to remind everybody, and we'll need your help in showing that you're going to have to reapply, and you'll only be guaranteed the 3 payments if you apply during the first window. This kind of gives you a sense, and so we've adjusted, again, as you see here, I'm going to start on the far right, operating status. Basically what we're saying is if you're closed, temporarily closed, that will run your numbers, but you'll only get a quarter of what you would have gotten if you were open. So really we've got to fund our temporarily closed programs, but the incentives here are to encourage folks to be open. And we imagine that the vast majority of our programs are open. We then set per child rates based on a kind of marginal rate that kind of goes up over time. Again, noting that we sort of in our family day homes, for instance, that have received the fewest COVID resources so far, they tend to be, closest to their capacity is their enrollment, and making some adjustments there, and then slightly reducing as we go up in size with this lower per child rate, but there's you've got more kids there. And so I'll talk in a minute about what you'll receive, but it's kind of adjusted for size, adjusted for, we also know that our larger programs tend to have more capacity to secure other resources. We're trying to kind of adjust for those sorts of things. This represents a slight shift from before where, and we know we had heard loud and clear from Family Day Homes that they felt like their per child funding was much less than some of the larger programs in prior rounds, and trying to make that adjustment. Next slide, please. And again, this idea of what is this SVI multiplier? Basically, we will use some of this national data to identify those counties, cities, or census tracts that have a high, and if they're considered more vulnerable, and you'll just get a little add-on. You'll get an add-on amount based on that. And again, this is to really recognize, we know that often our programs that are in our most underserved communities face some of the greatest challenges, often face the families who can afford to pay the least. And so wanting to provide a slight increase on the base rate to adjust for those higher costs and some of the kind of additional expectations when you serve some of the most vulnerable kids and families. And then this is the bonus for subsidy vendors. And so You might remember that I presented some data that showed that our participation subsidy had dropped really precipitously. We went from a program of over 20,000 kids to down to 15,000 at some point. And so we really need to bring our childcare subsidy program back. We're hearing it from employers who need, families to be able to return to work. We know that myself, including my little guy, really it was so important for him to be able to go back to preschool, back to childcare. And so we wanted to, through this ARPA stabilization grant process, to offer just to recognize those folks who are currently part of the subsidy program, and then to provide a bonus, a one-time 20% of your base as a bonus. So if you are already part of subsidy, you won't have to do anything. You'll get that 20% up front. If you're not part of subsidy, but you join during the grant period, then you'll receive that 20% bonus at that point. And again, this is only for open programs, because we need you, in order to increase subsidy participation, you got to be open in order to serve kids, subsidy kids. This gives you a sample of kind of the total grant awards. I know it feels like you're like $488 million. That's so much money. But then when you think about how many programs we have, right, 4,000 or 5,000 programs across the Commonwealth, when you start to divide it out, it's not quite as much as you might imagine. But to kind of give you a sense, you look at capacity, look at the rate per child, the operating status, are you high need or not? Just some kind of examples of what these payments might look like, as well as the one-time bonus. So the bonuses can be pretty significant in terms of that support. And this sort of echoes Roberta's question about the prior process. And I think something we're thinking about all the time as we continue to hear that as much effort as we're making to get the word out, that sometimes people still remain unaware. And as I noted before, we are going to have to get all of our providers to either reapply or apply if they haven't received these dollars previously. And we are budgeting for every eligible provider. So this is not first come, first serve. You will have to apply by the deadline in order to be eligible, but we really want everybody who's eligible to participate. And so we'll work once the system goes live to make sure everybody's aware of it. We'll work with our partners like the Child Care Association, Cheryl and her organization, the Head Start Association, in terms of the programs there, just getting the word out there, the Early Childhood Foundation, Voices, Child Care Aware. We'll work with our Smart Beginnings, PDG, and Ready Regions partners. Really kind of making sure that everybody who might be eligible is aware of this. With our new technology, we'll have the ability to monitor participation and look if we sort of see, well, we've got 500 programs open, but only 400 programs applied, and to kind of be able to do targeted outreach to those that didn't apply and to understand what's going on. And again, we've continued to hear that whether it's folks who are not as comfortable with technology, whether it's folks who are need materials in other languages, whether there are other kind of obstacles and barriers, really sort of thinking through anticipating those and continuing to work with our partners to address those. So translating materials, offering our help desk in multiple languages, some of the steps we'll take. So we were waiting for the appropriation to occur. The General Assembly has done that, and as we're finalizing in terms of a letter to the governor's office to make sure we've got all of our T's crossed and I's dotted. But now that has occurred, we're working furiously to get the technologies update so we can launch something live, to finalize the formula, and to create a very simple calculator so you can go in, type in your operating status, your license capacity, whether or not you take subsidy in your zip code, and you can understand what you're eligible for. We're hiring the staff to support this effort, that help desk, and to make sure that we can work closely with our providers across the state and partners. And then we're going to continue to work with the Early Childhood Foundation to help us either cut the paper checks or do direct deposit for our programs. With that in mind, I wanted to add one more caveat here. This is a program, and there's lots of different parts of the American Rescue Plan Act. So I should note that the Child Care Stabilization Grant Fund, which is one part of the ARPA or ARPA, really is focused on community-based child care programs that are not eligible for some of the school-based or the Head Start dollars. And so, the guidance from the Fed said this is supposed to be for those programs that are not receiving other dollars. We know that our Head Start partners have also received a significant amount in ARPA funding, as well as some of the other relief sources, as well as our schools have. So those are separate. So this is really a program that is focused on childcare, and that seeks to address the fact that some of our programs have not had access to the same federal relief resources that others have. So this is, for all of those details, you'll notice I really focused on childcare and family day homes. That our school and Head Start programs aren't really eligible for this, but there are a lot of other ARPA dollars that I'll spare us from going through today, but kind of, that the Office of Child Care has wanted to make sure that it's kind of there's equitable distribution, schools, Head Start, as well as our child care program. So with that, let me pause there and see if there's any questions, concerns, commentary as it relates to our efforts, continuing efforts to help stabilize the childcare industry in the Commonwealth as we continue to respond to this global pandemic and the pain and challenges it has caused for our early childhood sector.
Any questions in the chat box or any hands raised?
I knew it'd be the math,
Yep, I think that got us. No.
Kristen, we are, that is actually, Kristen asked, thank you for the hard work. Any idea when it will roll out? That is the $1 million question. We are working, our goal is to be able to get notification out, by the end of this month. We've got to get that technology in place. So we'll make sure that we, Becca will give you all a heads up the second it goes live. All right, I will then shift to our last, so unless you were licensed by March, you must be receiving subsidy. This is a question from Bev. I'll ask Becca. Becca knows this program in and out, Bev, so I will ask her to take a look at your question and kind of go back and forth with you to make sure we get your answer there. I do not want to get the wrong answer. All right. So the last key sort of update, I believe, here is really how we want to work with you to tackle some of the key areas that we need stakeholder engagement on. And so I know we've got a lot going on, but if you think back to when we started and we talked about the importance of the unification, and then once we were unified under one board and had our new Early Childhood Advisory Committee, that we would be an opportunity to take a look at, from in a unified fashion at some of our policies and practices. And so what we have today is a little bit more detail on how we're thinking about approaching that work. And we wanted to solicit your feedback before kicking that off. So we find it really important, and you've seen whether it's in partnership with our Smart Beginnings or VECF or Elevate Early Education or Voices, right? Trying to do webinars and listening sessions to hear from folks. We did listening sessions in person for Executive Director 4. We've done a lot of virtual listening sessions since then. We continue to meet with our association groups, often Saturday morning with our family child care providers, during the week with our Child Care Association providers, kind of continuing to work with other groups like Promise Partnership to hear from their provider advisory groups and their family advisory groups, as well as with our Head Start Association, doing webinars specific to there, as well as hearing out of their particular concerns. And we know that the topics have varied from the transition and the kind of transition work group to VQB5 and our new uniform and measurement improvement system to listening sessions, really specifically on COVID, right? How it's affected your programs, what we can do to help, and then kind of tackling some of our longstanding issues. How do we increase quality? how do we make sure that we can serve more kids, but we've really tried to engage broadly speaking the field over the last 24 months. We'll continue to do that, and oftentimes in these items, we'll bring you this feedback. So you might remember when we brought you the standards, we talked about all of the things, all of the feedback we heard via the online survey. When we talked about VQB5, we talked about how many people had participated in the 2 statewide webinars, some of the feedback we have received. And so you'll know whenever we bring something to you for endorsement that we're going to make sure that we do this full engagement and we think about it broadly, not just preschool, not just Head Start, not just childcare, family day homes, but inclusive of all of our programs. And that you'll sort of see from us continuing to go forward. We did want to acknowledge and talk a little bit about childcare licensing because when you look back over the last 24 months, over the last sort of 2 to 3 years, that while there's been really intensive engagement on things like access and quality and school readiness, there hasn't been as much engagement around some of our health and safety practices, that there was a lot of that work related to the federal reauthorizations. If we go back to 2015 and some of the changes that came about as a result of changes in federal law, but since then in recent years, we haven't really taken a kind of a collective look at some of these health and safety policies and practices. And so what we're here to suggest to this group today is that we take a more intensive approach. And when we talked with you way back when about the calendar for the year, we said, we got to move everything first, right? Move the people, get the agreements in place. And then once we're moved and mostly settled in, then we would begin to take a second look at some of these policies. We're starting to get to that point where we've now moved everything and we're prepared to take that second look. Next slide, please. So we are wanting to see if this group, and I know we've heard from Clark, who's probably out driving kids home right now, that he's very interested in this, but to create a work group, because there hasn't been that sort of same intensive focus that we've had, or this same volume of listening sessions or task force, to take a look at our childcare health and safety regulations. And again, I'll even say going beyond early childhood, and as I see sort of some of our partners who work with before and after school, like this is sort of fully inclusive of programs that that we license for or register or regulate. And so we are proposing that we create a work group, starting with sort of asking who of this body is interested to take a systematic look at the health and safety regulations. We'll look at the licensing regulations, we'll look at sort of what we say for other types of registered or regulated vendors, and we will also look at the health and safety expectations that come with being a child care subsidy vendor. So when we look at CCSP, that is the child care subsidy program. And we know that those things have been adjusted and adapted at different times. So we want to take a look at all of those things side by side this fall. We're looking to create a temporary short-term work group. I know folks might say I have way too much on my plate to sign up for anything and permanently here. So this is temporary and time limited. And we want to just start first by inviting and sort of seeing which of our ECAC members were interested and wanted to be a part of this body. We'll then look at sort of what that means in terms of our coverage, and then think about what other parties we might need to make sure we've got sort of full representation. Provider type, stakeholder parties, those who are expert in health and safety, right? We want to make sure we've got a good group. And basically that this group would meet separately from the ECAC and go through all of the regulations and be prepared to bring to us with our support. We'll staff this and support this to kind of come back first to the ECAC, and then we'll take it to the broader board with our set of recommended changes to our health and safety regulations. I'm already seeing some interest in the chat, which is great. And I know what we'll probably do is have Becca formally follow up. She'll email the group and then ask to kind of hear from you. This is our tentative timeline. We've got a lot going on, but we want to kick something off in October, do a first review session in November, second review in December, hold some time in January. But our goal is to get through and have by the first quarter of next year, the position to bring to the broader body, here are the set of proposed changes, right, that come from this mix of our practitioners, our providers, our health and safety experts on the proposed changes that we want to make to health and safety regulations here in the Commonwealth. And then we can go through the formal process around bringing it to this group for endorsement and then taking it to the board. So we will ask Becca to maybe want to do this. We've got the, I see folks expressing interest in chat, and don't worry, if you can't type fast enough in chat, we will ask Becca to formally send out an email to everybody. You can think about this. If there's additional questions, you want to kind of ask more, but again, we will wanted to sort of open this first and foremost to our ECAC members. For those of you say, I care about health and safety, it's not my top priority, what else is happening? I just want to let you know that as we talked about when we looked at our schedule for the next year, we're continuing to work on the access issue. So I know we've heard about concerns with the child care subsidy rate. Do we fund VPI at the appropriate rate? We sort of face too many things on the market, and the market isn't working, is particularly not working right now. And so we are taking all of that feedback and continuing to work on some recommendations there, both as it relates to the governor's budget as well as potentially policy and practice. So you'll hear us kind of doing this. If this is something that's more of interest and you'd like to be a little bit more involved, you can also email Becca about that. But we've had so much more engagement in this space than we have had in the licensing space. And so we felt it's really important to set up this separate, temporary, but really important work group as it relates to the health and safety regulations. Excellent. Next slide. I think that wraps us up. So let me pause there. So just in terms of kind of an update here, looping fully back, we had shared with you all when we kicked off this Early Childhood Advisory Committee that once we moved everything over, which we did successfully this summer, that we would begin to look at some of these longstanding policies and practice around health and safety and funding and quality measurement, which we've already started with OSBQB5. And now we're in that process of getting to that. We recognize a need for more intensive engagement on health and safety regulations. And so we wanted to start, and we'll invite anybody who's part of the ECAC who'd like to be on that short-term work group that's looking at those health and safety regulations. And we'll continue to work on some of the access issues. So I know we've heard from folks who are like, we've got to fix the subsidy rate. We've got to fix the subsidy rate for our family day homes. We need more funding for our schools. So we're working on that in preparation for two things. One is for the next biennial budget, which that work will start later this fall, as well as for some of the regulations that are now under the oversight of the Board of Education and the Department of Education as of July 1st of this year. So that was just an update, because I know that folks had said, when will we get a little more involved? And so we're pleased to say today is the moment at which we can engage people, particularly on these health and safety issues. So with that, Shecky, let me pause there and see if there's any questions about some of this engagement effort and what we're looking to do. We'll probably still do much of that engagement work group if we can, and I'll ask Becca to check on this virtually so that it's a little easier for folks to participate. But we will be returning to our kind of formal in-person meetings come November. Questions, concerns, commentary, any kind of other things to add as it relates to engagement, particularly on our new health and safety work group?
I'll just note quickly, I've made note of the couple of folks that indicated interest in participating, and will absolutely follow up after the meeting with a reminder to shoot me a note if you are interested. And we will be convening those conversations virtually to really be able to kind of maximize participation and just make the most of all of our busy schedules. So we are excited to kick that off this fall.
Yeah, and Becca makes an important point. We really will make sure to account for. I know we've got some challenges now that school and care is back open, and with staffing shortages, folks are driving buses and needing to provide supervisory coverage to rooms. So we'll try to be very thoughtful about the timing of these work group meetings so that we can ensure full participation, particularly for those of you who are day in, day out directly serving kids and families. So that's a really important flag. Thanks for reminding us of that, Becca. Any other questions, comments? If not, I think I'll turn it back over to you, Shaki, but let me pause and just see, raise your hand, go off mute, let us know. Thanks, Bev. We'll talk to you soon.
Raising my hand.
Jennifer. Yeah.
I just, if we aren't on the work group, I know that you got a lot of input from many people about the health and safety regulations, so you probably have heard them all, but if we're not on the work group, or can we just send, if we have something specific we want to make sure is addressed to Rebecca or somebody so it can get to that work group?
Absolutely.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, Jennifer, that's a great recommendation. And I'll be sure to, again, include kind of a vehicle for folks to share specific input or recommendations, even if they're not necessarily participating.
Yeah, and I know one of the things we've done, and this is a good point, Becca, and we should talk with Jeff about this, is, for example, right, with our early learning development standards, we also at some point posted a very simple SurveyMonkey or Google form to just capture thoughts from the field. So, I don't think we can manage sort of opening this up broadly to all of our providers. We want to start with our early childhood advisory committee meetings, as you all are the representatives, the sort of the duly noted sort of representatives of the field. I do think we can think through both what we can get from you in writing. If you hear from others who want to submit something in writing, what channels we can do to do that, as well as potentially some survey or easy to use mechanism to kind of capture feedback more broadly. I know that's something that can be effective for those who are super duper busy and can't make meetings but want to share their input. And so that's a really important flag.
Jenna, do you envision the work of this work group? Would you be bringing any kind of draft suggestions or core areas where things are, as you have done in some other things, where people will start with something that has been at least chewed up a little bit, or are you starting from scratch and just looking at what's there?
Yeah, no. That's a really important point, both in terms of time is everybody's scarcest resource. So we will staff these, right, and do the kind of preparation work, which is both kind of assembling all of the resources and materials that people need, as well as coming up for a kind of a thoughtful format on how to go through things, how to capture feedback. I have had the opportunity to do this at least twice in another state, and it is thinking through that formatting and how we kind of bring a straw man or something for folks to respond to is absolutely important. It's a starting point, but yes, otherwise we know it could go into all sorts of conversations, and so we would bring that. And then I think similarly, as we get that work group to kind of settle on a set of key kind of a proposal, thinking through how we make sure that you all have as much advance notice. Potentially, Becca, work the flag, probably you need more than a week to read through. So thinking through how we get a structure and something that you can respond to when we bring it to the full advisory committee too. Those are really important points.
And just full disclosure, the October meeting we will not be bringing any kind of material necessarily or recommendations. That will be more of kind of a level setting conversation, an opportunity for folks to just kind of, again, get to know each other a little bit, talk a little bit about kind of broad goals and priorities for the changes. And then we'll actually kind of get into some substance in the following conversation.
Jenna, you answered this question in the chat box. Can they nominate individuals from their teams to join the work group?
Yeah, so our general preference on this is, because we've had a full application process around the advisory committee, is to to say kind of we are guaranteeing a slot to any kind of advisory committee member. Miriam, we'll talk offline. I think if you've got somebody you'd like to nominate, we could consider it. But again, out of kind of fairness more broadly, we can guarantee participation to any early childhood advisory committee member themselves, and we can consider other individuals. But we kind of want to balance between recognizing this body and the important way in which you've been sort of duly appointed to this role. And again, we're going to have some other folks, so I'm not saying it's a definitive of no there, but would want to just consider it and kind of look at the kind of broader context of the group, how big it is, kind of what groups are represented, et cetera, et cetera. So Becca can follow up with you, Miriam, and we would love to learn a little bit more about who you think might be good for this group. So, and that's extended to anybody. If there's somebody out there, it's not you, and you either want to do it in addition, or you think there's somebody who'd be great, please feel free to share that with Becca. I just don't want to promise that we can accommodate all of that, just in terms of being sort of very thoughtful about size and representation. Anything else that you're seeing here, Shaki?
I don't see anything else.
Well, excellent. So again, thank you, everybody. I know this was a lot of information today, but as the world continues to evolve really rapidly, we thought it was important, even though we didn't have any endorsement items per se today, to walk you through these important strategic updates that are occurring in the sector, right? And that kind of affect all of us. So, we'll come back to you in the fall as it relates to how we're moving forward on the ready regions and the infrastructure building. That's sort of really important when you think of your endorsement on VQB5. We'll make sure to alert you the moment that the stabilization grant program goes live, and so you can get those out. And we will reach back out on some deep engagement around health and safety regulations for those of you who might be interested in participating. And then we'll also come back to you a little later with sort of more details about what it means if we meet in person, and kind of helping sort of think through who can come in person, who prefer to stay virtual. And there's more information to come in the fall on kind of increasing access and efforts in the governor's biennial budget, and other efforts under the way to kind of use some of the relief dollars as well as additional federal dollars to serve as many kids as possible as we go into continuing to support our communities and our Commonwealth to respond from the pandemic. With that, huge thank you to everybody for making this time. I know we've got a lot going on, and it's aggressive to set a meeting in early September when folks are so focused on back to school and back to care. I've had the opportunity to join the First Lady, who's going to all of our regions across the state to visit childcare and Head Start and school-based programs. And it's just the energy out there is so contagious and palpable. And, I know folks are still nervous and anxious, and there's a lot of unknown again, but deep appreciation on behalf of the board, the Department of Education, the Governor and First Lady, and everybody for the just incredible reopening work that has gone been put in place over the course of this summer and fall. It just matters so much for kids. I mean, my kids couldn't be more excited to be back in person. And I know that that's just a microcosm of our kids, our infants, our toddlers, preschoolers, and other kids across the Commonwealth. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you, and really appreciate this group giving us this time this afternoon. Becky, I turn it back to you. The wrap.
Thank you, Jenna. Thank you and your team for all of the hard work and the presentations that you put together to keep us informed and to get our feedback and input. Thank you, committee members, for your feedback and your willingness to continue to work on the work group. And so we look forward to convening in October for that. Our next meeting is scheduled for November the 10th at 2 p.m. And so having said that, we're going to give you 25 minutes of your day back. And we hope that you enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and we'll see you soon. This meeting is adjourned.